Hello everybody and welcome to Women of the NHS Podcast with me, your host, Kate Kelly. This podcast is about celebrating and collaborating with women of the NHS from a variety of backgrounds and roles within the NHS. Within the podcast, we will be informally chatting about their experiences and stories, exploring these women's opinions on medical school, female representation, hopes for the future of a more inclusive NHS, medical conditions that disproportionately affect women, and the nitty-gritty in between. I am excited to be interviewing and working with women in different stages of their career and across different sectors of the NHS. I want this podcast to celebrate women of the NHS and shine a light on the female experience from different perspectives. Today, I am so excited to introduce Dr Bushera, who is a GP with a special interest in women's health. Dr Bushera, please can you tell us more about your specialism and why you chose it?
I think a career in general practice really suited my personality because I really like people. I like getting to know people's stories. So I think that side of being in general practice, when you get to know people basically from cradle to grave, you get relationships with them, see the same people. So that really attracted me to the people side of it, but also the broad range of different medical pathologies that you can see. So you see a variety of different things, and no day's the same. So I quite like the variety and the sociable aspect of it. And I love the fact that you're in such a privileged position where, you know, people will trust you with information that they don't tell a single person in the world, but you'll be privy to that kind of information. And it's quite a special place to be in with people because they do generally tend to trust you as their doctor.
And why specifically women's health?
I think I kind of fell into it as my first job. I always had an interest in it and I was developing it, but my first job was joining a GP practice where there'd been 4 male doctors and not had a female doctor there for a considerable number of years. I think it was something like 12 years. So when I joined, all of a sudden I was getting a large volume of the female patients that maybe hadn't felt comfortable to present to the other doctors or would just prefer to see a female. So then I further developed the interest and did some more qualifications in it. And I quite like it because it's to be specialised in a problem solving. You have greater insight being a woman yourself. But also it's all stuff that's going to be useful to me potentially in the future as a potential patient myself. So it's quite nice to have a specialism in that area.
Yeah. Sorry, I feel like I've already gone off piece ever so slightly, but I've just got one more question that's a bit random, not one of the ones I sent you.
It's okay.
But yeah, when I'm just thinking about women's health in general, so because you hear lots of news stories about how women are given maybe like the same medicine or like all these trials are on men instead of women. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious about your thoughts about that, you know, like, so in terms of like the inequalities about women's health, do you feel like it's quite...
Yeah, I think the inequalities across medicine are quite apparent still, just looking at disparities between the different sexes, even when it comes down to pay, you know, access to the top positions, access to management roles within the NHS. So there's disparities against that, and also with regards to ethnicity as well. There is, you know, they say that there's a glass ceiling, but that, you know, people don't even get a chance to even progress in certain fields because of things that are basically prejudice against them. But it is a massive difference with regards to access to trials. I think there's a lot of work being done to try and balance the inequalities and studying a broad range of the population, not just specific, you know, white, middle-aged men. There is work being done around that, but there's a long way to go, I think, and we do need to have more research where it represents the general population as a whole rather than just representing more women, because there's intersectionality amongst that as well.
Yeah. How did you find medical school?
So medical school was brilliant. It was the first time I'd ever lived away from home. So I was 18 years old. I moved towns to Leeds. I studied in Leeds. So it was a real massive culture shock, because I'd gone from living quite in a very strong family unit, and then living with 5 other strangers. But it was actually brilliant. So I lived with 6 girls. There were 6 of us all together, and we all got on really well, from across the country, doing different courses. So it was really great. It was really great for my confidence, meeting lots of different people. Medical school was tough. It was tough in terms of I had a lot of hard work to do. Also felt like, being from an ethnic minority and a female at medical school, you were always kind of like, felt that you had to work that bit harder or be that much better to shine in order to get recognition or to be perceived to be doing as well as the others. So that was something that was always at the back of our minds. But I made some fantastic friends who I'm still friends with now. So this year will be our 25-year anniversary of when we met.
Oh, wow.
At university. Yeah, so my best friends, we lived together, we studied and graduated from Leeds. It was brilliant in terms of the people that I met, the life experiences that we've shared at medical school and since then. And it's propelled us into careers in medicine, which we all really lucky to be in.
How has the NHS changed since kind of starting out, since you were at medical school and the first early years? So
the changes in the NHS, I would say that it feels like we've become more understaffed. Workers in the NHS feel more and more unappreciated, and the workload has got higher and higher. Certainly within general practice, I'll give you an example. 2 of our senior partners retired this year, and we've not been able to recruit to replace them. So we've got a massive increase in our workload, but we are really struggling to recruit, and it's across the board in different specialties as well. A lot of people, especially doctors who I know, are moving abroad for better working conditions, better pay, and also better work-life balance. So I think that the working conditions are getting more difficult for us to earn a good enough income versus having time off, versus being able to afford the things that you do. And with the cost of living crisis, that's made it a lot more difficult for a lot of people in the NHS. So unfortunately, I think that there's been a lot of changes, and it boils down to underfunding, and also the appreciation. So during the pandemic, the doctors and the healthcare staff were the good guys, but now, a few years later, we're all the bad guys. People are striking for better pay, so it seems like the attitude has changed, or the media reporting of it has changed. So it's difficult to gauge what people think.
How did you feel about the clap?
So at the time, we thought, it was a really nice thing to do. It gave people a sense of community, because they were doing it together. During the pandemic, people often didn't know their neighbours before then, but during the pandemic, people got to know their neighbours. It really did bring people together and a support network. Where I grew up in an end terrace house, and we knew everybody on our terrace street, all our neighbours, the kids. We would all play together. We would all know each other really well. And now that we live in the suburbs, we live in a semi-detached house. You only know your neighbours maybe across the road to you and either side. But even then, it wasn't on the same level as where I grew up. But I think the clap, coming back to your question, it was heartwarming at the time, but then it just feels like, was it disingenuous because it's soon forgotten?
Yeah. How have you been affected by the strike action, and what are your thoughts on it?
So initially there was the junior doctors strike, and I'm fully supportive of them, because from when I graduated, at that time, it was the first time you were earning, but we didn't have the massive student debt that the junior doctors have now. So you, as a newly qualified doctor, you graduating with at least £30,000 to £40,000 worth of debt as a minimum, and you're being paid a small amount, and from that you've got to pay your rent, pay your bills, your council tax, and also pay off your student loans and have some money to actually enjoy your life. And you do sacrifice many years of your life working in the hospitals or working towards your specialism, where you have to move where you live every 6 months because you're on different rotations in different areas. They might not all be close together. So there's a lot of work that you put in, and I think that they should be rewarded enough to be able to have a comfortable life and not be struggling. We've heard of lots of doctors using like food banks, junior doctors who just not being able to afford to live or to afford rent or to even look at getting on the housing market. So there seems like there's something definitely broken with the system there. And now all the way up to the consultants are now striking for better working conditions. It seems like there's thousands of doctors every year who are actually moving to Australia, Canada, because with the qualifications in the UK, they are recognised in other places. The money is part of it, but also the work-life balance, because they're working very, very long hours here as well. So, and then when you finish working, you've got very minimal time where you can get to enjoy your life. So I think a lot of the consultants are moving abroad as well for that balance. So I'm fully supportive of the juniors and the consultants. It's slightly different for the GPs because as a GP partner, you are self-employed, so and then you're given a contract, right. But you deliver it as a self-employed. So we're not employed as like the hospital consultants and the junior doctors are. So it's slightly different, but there are a lot of grumblings amongst the general practitioners as well.
Are you more flexible with your hours then, is it?
So you basically work as much as you need to you get, say, like a pot of money to deliver the services for your patients. So whether you decide to do those yourself or employ other doctors or other healthcare professionals to help with seeing the patients, that's how you run the business. But I know there's a lot of practices who are struggling to deliver the services with the money that they are getting. So a lot of GP practices are actually handing their contract back because they're not able to fulfil them. So I think that's going to happen more and more in the future if things get worse with the cost of living crisis and things.
Yeah. It's really sad to hear that doctors are going to food banks.
Yeah, I heard that with some junior doctors about that. They were just struggling to with the cost of living crisis, and they are not on a massively high income when they first graduate. So.
Yeah. Have you or a colleague that you know ever experienced sexism, homophobia, or racism within the workplace?
Yes, I have. I would say that when I first qualified as a GP in my surgery, like I mentioned, I was the first female GP there for very many years, and also being like quite a newly qualified doctor, I had a lot of patients not really trusting my medical opinion at that time, or they would assume that they'd seen me and I wasn't a doctor, that I was a nurse. So actually they would then phone up and see the other doctors for a second opinion to check what I'd done was correct.
Wow.
Or they wouldn't want to see me because they perceived me to be too young and inexperienced, which I kind of understand, but I think some of it was to do with my age, and also maybe they didn't perceive me as being a qualified doctor.
Yeah.
I think as a junior doctor, there were some instances where I felt like I had differential treatment because of the colour of my skin. And it sometimes it's very difficult to prove, because when somebody's overtly racist towards you, that's actually quite easy to handle, because this person has said this and it's very black and white. It's the very subtle things that it's really difficult to sometimes explain, but that you get the sense of this person is not treating me the way I should be treated because they don't like me, because they've made a judgment on something. And it might not always be the colour of your skin, but sometimes you feel like it could be.
Yeah.
And you can't prove that. But I do know that a lot of my colleagues and some of my friends have experienced quite gross, overt Islamophobia and also racism working in the NHS, where there's been bullying amongst managers and from their managers, and also from peers as well. And I think that it is something that should be challenged. I do know I'm a trainer now, so I train other junior doctors to become GPs, and I've had talks with some trainees who have experienced quite significant racism, both from patients and also the seniors in their teams, and that's really upsetting to hear, but it does happen. And you know, and often those people who have told me about it don't want to say anything because of fear of what it would mean for their future careers. They just want to put it behind them and not have to deal with it again, which I completely understand and respect. But you can understand why, you know, they don't challenge it, and quite often it's because they're international graduates. Right. So they have a perception that it, you know, will be really detrimental towards their career. So there's that extra fear. So often it's not always talked about.
Yeah. So I was just curious, was you kind of talking about how, you know, with yourself, these women feel comfortable talking to you, but what's the sort of system like, the structure? Like, is there much support in terms of this, or is it just kind of like most people just actually would rather just not talk about it?
Yeah, I think that there are support structures, you know, and I think of recent years at the Royal College of GPs and other, like the training schools, they, you know, pushing on equality and diversity training and, you know, trying to be more inclusive, and making sure that they're, you know, providing much support for people who are experiencing that. But I think there's also a bit of naivety that I don't think that they understand the scale of the problem. But it's something that is being looked at, and I think there's lots of external groups who are trying to, you know, really push that agenda forward and working with people who've experienced that level of racism. But also things like even the GMC, you know, you're more likely to be reported to the GMC if you are from an ethnic minority background, and more likely to be struck off or have much heavier punishments if you are from an ethnic minority background. So it's something that, you know, that we all feel that is unfair, but it's when your regulatory body is also deemed to be unfair, then it's just... it's like, who do you trust?
Do you feel there is, we've kind of sort of briefly touched on this, but do you feel there is sufficient mental health care for medical professionals? So for example, if you experience something maybe quite traumatic with a patient, or just something that's, I don't know, you might need to talk to somebody else about it, is there kind of like a support network in place for...
I think there are support networks. It's like if you feel that you are suffering with mental health issues and need some counselling, there are support things like that. But we do know that there's a very high rate of suicide amongst medical practitioners, and often, you know, that sometimes it can be on the back of a complaint or some kind of disciplinary through work. For example, people who have been referred to the GMC, there used to be quite a long wait for them to get an outcome of the investigation. There's a high portion of people who committed suicide whilst they were waiting for this GMC investigations. I would say, like, you know, there is a level of transparency. If you have a hard day, you see patients, and, you know, you hear some really harrowing or upsetting things. So it depends on the environment that you work in, because general practice can be quite isolating sometimes if you're working you're working on your own in a room with people coming in and out. So unless you sort out one of your colleagues, and I've just seen this, which we tend to do, and talk to each other about difficult cases or someone who's just stuck on your mind. I think having like a peer support group is quite good. So, you know, people who are medics who understand. So like if I told my husband, say, who's non-medical about something, he'd be absolutely traumatised and horrified and probably would lose sleep over it. So I would be very selective of what I would tell him. I tend to tell him like good cases are happy cases, or pick this up or something like that. But the difficult ones I probably wouldn't tell him because the impact it would have on his mental health.
Yeah.
But if you're speaking to other doctors, usually my friends in a peer group, and tell them about a case, obviously not giving any confidential information, but just general discussions around a case, that can be really helpful. So I think it's probably more in your individual support groups. But there are groups available for people who are suffering with their mental health, but it's not something that I really know too much about because I've not accessed them, but there are definitely support more so available now for practitioners who are struggling. Yeah.
It is very difficult when you've been, because I mean it's nowhere near the same level as obviously you, but when a child comes to you and
absolutely you're in a very privileged position there. Yeah. But
when you get disclosed that kind of safeguarding issue, it's very difficult not to. It kind of stays with you, and I imagine you have the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
What would you do if you had the power to change elements of the NHS?
I think I would diversify the top level workforce, so people in the boards, the CEOs, who making management decisions about it. I would make sure that there was an accurate representation of different populations, including ethnic minorities and more women in the top positions, because there is that disparity, and I think they make more inclusive decisions on how better systems for everybody if the voices of everybody are heard. So I think that would be one of the main things, I think. And also diversifying the doctors who are training. So at the moment, as we're getting on, it's getting more and more expensive to go to medical school. So you tend to get people who are from very rich backgrounds going. I'm from a working class background. My parents both worked, and I was incredibly lucky to be able to go to university and not have to pay extortionate tuition fees. So, if it was my time again, I might be put off and not be going to medical school because of those high levels of debt and borrowing that would have to occur. So I think having a look at the people who are becoming the future doctors, is if we're going to have just like people from very rich middle upper class families, we're going to have a very different workforce. It's important to have people from all walks of life who are definitely capable. It's just about the opportunities to be there. So I think diversifying the populations from where they come from, so we've got more representation across the board, really. I think that's the way to change the attitudes. And I think we haven't got enough doctors or nurses and all the healthcare staff, and we go abroad. We often recruit from abroad, which is great, but we also need to try and encourage homegrown nurses and make it easier for people to train as nurses and more attractive as a career, because previously you were able to have a bursary to train to become a nurse, but that's been removed. So it's naturally going to have a negative impact on the number of nurses who are going to be able to train at home. So I think that would be another thing, more resources for people to train here to access those kind of careers.
Yeah. How do you feel women are represented within the NHS or medical profession?
So I would say considering that the women make up a large proportion of the workforce, particularly doctors now in medical schools, there's a large amount of women. There's more women than men training to become doctors. I would say that it still doesn't seem to be, the PR of it doesn't seem to be getting across that, the women are a higher proportion of the workforce. It still seems like it's a very much male-dominated profession, that it means to be that the males are the ones who are making all the big decisions. I think the perception when women have to go on maternity leave to go away and have their babies is deemed as a negative, and it does have a negative impact on women's careers as well when they're of childbearing age, what specialty they're going to go into. If they are perceived that they're going to go away and have children, it's like a negative thing, and sometimes it's not very well supported. I think more so in hospital, but that might be an assumption of mine. And I would say that the famous women in medicine are not well known because they're not just talked about. So I think that there's probably some learning to do for what famous women have done throughout the years for the field of medicine. I would say there's definitely some learning there for me personally as well.
Yeah. That kind of leads perfectly to the next question. So when you're thinking about the history of medicine and the NHS, is there a particularly influential woman that you would consider a hero or idol? And if you can't think of anyone in the NHS or medicine, just in life or in general, who's kind of an idol for you and why?
I would say I would have to look closer to home. And I would say two significant women in my life would be my mum. Because my mum came to this country when she was 18 years old, very young, and when she got married, and then went on to have 6 children, and really fought hard and pushed us all to do well. And my older sister was the first female doctor in our whole family. And my eldest sister was the first female in our whole family to ever go to university. In further education, she's a head teacher. So I think that's because of my mum. We're an immigrant family, first generation British, born in the Northwest, and thanks to my parents, but especially my mum, to push her daughters to do well. And then my older sister Nyla, she's a GP as well. Her and my older sister were real trailblazers. They moved away from home, went to university in a different town, which was very much unheard of back then. And it was a very new thing. Being a male and going to university was a big thing, but as females, it wasn't very much. It was an unknown to a lot of people, and people were scared about that. But my parents put their trust in my sisters. So when it was my turn to be applying for university, it was very easy because they'd already trodden that path, and it was never questioned that I would go wherever I got a place and where I wanted to go. So I would say more closer to home, that would be my mum and my sisters. Just propelling us onto this path of further education and achieving our potential.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
You're very welcome.
They're all my questions.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Women of the NHS Podcast. I would like to thank again Dr Bushera for her time and conversation and being on Women of the NHS Podcast. I would also like to thank Jemima Grosset for her beautiful music production and turning my vision into sound. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.